Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about something a little bit different. This is not a book per se, it's really a review of a curriculum, but there are some books involved. I want to talk about the How People Change curriculum. This is put out by New Growth Press. The authors and speakers in the curriculum, it's both a video series and then there are these workbooks I want to talk about written by Timothy Lane and Paul David Tripp. So this is curriculum that's put out by both biblical counselors, Tim Lane and Paul Tripp, who are associated with CCEF. They've been Christian counselors, authors, speakers for many, many years, and they put together this curriculum to try and equip churches and small groups and ministries to better understand the process of the Christian life, the process of sanctification, and the process of counseling. So this is a really interesting curriculum. We just finished going through it as a church, and I and the elders kind of took our congregation through it. And so I want to talk a bit about what the curriculum does as a whole, and then specifically I want to talk about the study guide that they offer with the curriculum and the facilitator's guide as well. And they're largely the same material, but a little bit different. So I'll talk about that and share what I really liked, what I found helpful, and what I think could be improved with the curriculum. So first off, let me just step back and talk a little bit more about what this curriculum is trying to do, and then we'll get into how they do it and how the videos and the books and all of that fit together. So what they're trying to do in this course, as I said, is to really help us as Christians understand what it means to be followers of Christ in a fallen world. And they talk about the fact that so often in our understanding of the gospel or our understanding of the Christian life, we have a really good grasp on the past tense implications of the gospel, right? We know what the gospel message is. If we present it, we'll present it in a kind of historical way. Jesus died on the cross for my sins, which is true. And then we'll look forward and we say, okay, and because of what Jesus did on the cross, one day I'm going to live with Christ in glory. I'm going to be united with his people. I'm going to be purified from sin. I have all of this to look forward to. But where we get fuzzy oftentimes in our thinking about the Christian life and in our living out of the Christian life is in the in-between. What do you do between, to use Paul's language from Titus chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, what do you do between Christ coming in grace, which already happened on the cross, and Christ coming in glory, which will happen when we go to be with him or when he comes to judge the earth at the end of all time? What happens in the in-between? What is that all about? And that's really where the How People Change curriculum steps in. It says this is where we really need to get a deeper understanding of what the Bible says about the Christian life. Because the biblical answer to that question, what do you do between the coming of Christ in grace and the coming of Christ in glory, is exactly what Paul talks about in Titus chapter 2. He says the grace of God has appeared, past tense, in order to train us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of Christ in glory, right? That's where we live, between these two appearings. And what's happening now is that Christ is changing us by his grace, changing us by his Spirit. All of that is another way of talking about sanctification, that wonderful blessing and benefit of the gospel, whereby we're not only justified, right, declared righteous before God, but we actually become righteous more and more as we die to sin and live to righteousness. We become more like Christ. And the argument of this curriculum is that that is God's great project that he is doing in and through his church. So they do a good job of helping the individual believer understand how they are to live their life, but never of individualizing that message. And so they spend a lot of time talking about the communal nature of our Christian growth and of our Christian walk, which is part of where their emphasis as counselors come in. That they really want us to understand that we all need counsel, we receive counsel, and so they're encouraging us to get that from God's word and from godly people, but also saying that we as Christians have an opportunity and an obligation, even they would say, to give biblical counsel, to encourage others in their walk. And that's what this curriculum is trying to do. It's trying to give that big biblical vision for what God is doing in our lives right now, to help us understand what that looks like in the day-to-day, and to help us begin to think about each other as pilgrims along the way, as fellow pilgrims that we need to encourage and help, and that we need encouragement and help from as well. So that's kind of what the curriculum is doing as a whole. Now, how do they do that? Well, they have a series of videos that they recorded. The longest of them is about a half hour. The shortest of them is about 10 or 12 minutes. Most kind of fall somewhere in between 15 to 20 minutes. And I think there are 13 or 14 videos total. I think there's an introduction video, a conclusion video, and then 12 sessions. And those are taught, I think, about half and half by Tim Lane, teaches about half of them, and then Paul Tripp does the other half. They do a wonderful job in there of walking you through the major parts of this argument. And they begin by just taking a couple of sessions to build that biblical foundation, build that biblical framework. And then what they do in the remainder of the course is they spend quite a bit of time unpacking this graph here. Now, if you're familiar with CCEF material or other things that New Growth Press has put out, this might look a little familiar to you. This is something that I think Dave Pallison actually put together. It might have been Paul Tripp, I'm not sure on that. But to help portray how the Bible describes the Christian life in this world. And they go through each of these elements: heat, thorns, cross, and fruit. Now, to unpack this fully, you'd really want to work through the whole book or watch the video series and it would all become clear. But let me just give you a really quick couple-minute explanation of this so you can track a little bit with what they're getting at. They talk about how, biblically speaking, and they're rooting this in a couple of different passages in Jeremiah and some of the prophets and other places, but they talk about how we as Christians, even though we've been saved by grace, even though we're destined for glory, still live in a fallen world. We live in that desert place. We live in that wilderness. And so there's going to be heat, pressure, difficult circumstances, trials, temptations, struggles that impact us in our lives. But then what they talk about from there is that in our fallen nature, we respond. We always are responding to things that take place. Oftentimes, when we talk about things, we talk about things very passively. But the reality is, there's always circumstances that are outside of our control that are shaping our world. But then we are also responding to those circumstances. And oftentimes, where the breakdown happens is that we miss our responsibility to respond, and we think it's just the circumstances. And so a lot of us spend our time trying to get rid of the heat, when really what's going on is the heat is unavoidable. We live in a fallen world. We live in a sinful world. We're sinful people ourselves. There's going to be that heat. How do you respond to it? As a thorn bush or as a fruit tree? Now, if you were just to take it at that level and kind of blot out the cross here, right, you would have a very kind of moralistic self-help book. Hey, there are bad things that happen, but are you going to respond in a healthy way or an unhealthy way? And that may help you manage your behaviors a little bit better, but it's not going to get to the heart of things. And that's why they root all of this in the cross. They say, yes, we live in a fallen world, and we're going to feel the heat of that. And yes, by nature, our hearts are tempted to respond in thorny ways, right? In sinful and angry and bitter and depressed ways. But the cross transforms our life. It gives us new power. It gives us a new relationship. It places us in a new community, all of which God uses to allow us to no longer be thorn bushes responding with sinful responses, but fruit trees responding in healthy, biblical ways. And change happens as we begin to understand these different dynamics and as we begin to look to Christ more than we do to the heat of our circumstances, which allows us to then respond with new and surprising fruit. Now, what I just summarized, they spend, again, 12 weeks going through. There's a lot more to say there, but that's really what the course is all about. And what they put together is the video series, which you can either get as a DVD or as a digital download. And they also put together a study guide. There is, by the way, I should mention, a book called How People Change. It's got a similar cover to this. It covers a lot of the same ground. It has a few extra things, but it's kind of a separate product, if you will. This is the curriculum, which is designed for groups to go through. And there's a lot to like in this. Not only do they give you, kind of summaries of each lesson and everything, but they give you really good things to discuss, to go through. They review each lesson, what you did last time. They kind of boil down what you're going to be looking at by pulling out what's the central point, what's the central application, what's the big question. And then it gives you small group activities you can do, and importantly, homework for each week. So some of that is stuff that you read and reflect on, but it also gives you very practical exercises to tackle as well. Questions to answer, passages to read, exercises to complete, and that homework is broken up into different sections, each of which ends with a make it real section where it's more practical, more personal. And about partway through the book, about halfway through the book, they encourage participants to pick an area of their life. It could be a bigger thing or a smaller thing, to say, this is what I want to focus on changing by God's grace in God's way. This is my personal growth project, and they kind of help you chart that through. So there's a lot of really helpful things there. I appreciated that. They also provide a facilitator's guide, which you can use for those who are leading. So like in our context, we were doing this during our Sunday school hour at church. So myself and a number of our elders and one or two others were leading the discussions. And so what we would do is we would have people do the homework for a lesson, and we would come together in class, and we would spend between 10 and 30 minutes kind of reviewing and discussing some of those things from last week's lesson, and then we would watch a video which would set us up for the next lesson. People would go home and do their homework, come back, we'd discuss and talk a little bit more, and then watch the next video, and so on and so forth. That was kind of the way that we did that. And the Facilitator's Guide is a useful resource to help leaders as they prepare to lead. Now, really there's only two things that set the Facilitator's Guide apart from the study guide. The first thing is that there's a longer introduction at the beginning, which has a facilitator's preparation guide. It helps the leader to understand what exactly their role is and gives some tips and pointers for how the curriculum's put together and how to teach it. And so there's some helpful material there, about 15 pages worth of stuff. And then within each lesson, it has the exact same questions and everything that that the study guide has, but for questions where it's more factually based, it will give you short answers. So for example, here's from lesson 3, they want you to read from Ephesians 2, and they ask some questions like, in this passage, what is God seeking to produce in us, his people? Well, for the facilitator's guide, they give you a little, one sentence answer. God is producing one new body, people who are joined together and moving toward one another. He is producing a dwelling place for his spirit. So just little things that can kind of help you to navigate that. And so all in all, a helpful resource. Now, let me talk about what I think could be improved about this curriculum, because I was excited to do it, and I think it was a good course, and I enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. But there were a few complications in the way they have it laid out. The first thing I would say about particularly these two books is that the study guide and the facilitator's guide, again, are almost the same. The main difference is at the front end, they put in some extra material. Here's my frustration. Because of the way they did that, the numbers in the facilitator's guide and the page numbers in the study guide are different. And so if you don't have a copy of both, it's very hard. So like if I'm giving this one of my elders and they're supposed to be leading and they're doing their homework and it's on page 104, it may be on page 83 in the study guide. But how are they supposed to know that, right? And I had a copy of both, but then I had to spend time going back and forth and saying, okay, well, here's what it is in my facilitator's guide, but what is the page number in the study guide? And that was just an unnecessary complication, because all you have to do is either put the facilitator's guide information at the end of the book instead of the beginning, so it's not messing up your page numbering, or even easier, just use Roman numerals for that facilitator's preparation guide, and then start the numbering of the lessons on the same page as the study guide does. So that was just a simple thing. If anyone at New Growth Press is watching this and you make another version, that change would be really easy and would make people's lives a lot easier. The other thing I would say, which maybe is a bigger kind of thing, is when my elders and I got a hold of this material, it was kind of confusing to think through how this is supposed to fit into our Sunday school hour. It was advertised and billed as being something that fits well for a Sunday school to go through. But the material that they have in here for you to go through each week averages between 80 and 90 minutes. I don't know anyone who has an hour and a half Sunday school hour. If we had a small group, we might be able, that might fit better, although even that's a long study time, an hour and a half. It seemed like what this was best suited for was for would be almost for like a if you did like a seminar at your church, right, and had a couple of days where you were doing that or something, or again maybe a small group without kids where you're just gathering for an hour or two and kind of working through. But it seemed like there was too much material to really fit into what I would think of as the standard Sunday school or even small group kind of time frame. And so I think either figuring out how to distill or better divide the activities and material you want people to do, or just identifying, okay, here's the things that are essential. What would have been helpful is if they said, hey, if you have an hour, here's what you should do. If you have 45 minutes, here's what you should do. If you have an hour and a half, here's what you should do. And just giving the leader a chance to kind of pick and choose a little bit, and but a little bit more guidance there. So we worked it out. We figured out what made sense for us. We got the rhythm and routine down, and I think it was a profitable class. But it took a little bit of playing with it as leaders to kind of structure the class, and then it took a little bit of explanation with the congregation for them to say, okay, what's exactly the schedule? What are we doing this week? Because I think one of the strengths of this class is each lesson is kind of a link in the chain, and so each lesson connects to what comes before, and each lesson sets you up for what comes after. So that's very helpful in terms of grasping the content, but it makes it a little hard when you're trying to lay it out in the syllabus. So I don't know exactly what the answer to that would be, but again, if anyone at New Growth Press ever watches this, I love the material. The theme is so needed. It's so valuable. The videos are wonderful. The study guide questions are really helpful. I like that there's a facilitator's guide and a study guide, but a few of those tweaks, some of which are very easy, just getting the study guide and the facilitator's guide to match up in page numbers, and then maybe giving a bit more help for pastors to think through how does this fit in more of a 45-minute to an hour time slot instead of the hour and a half time slot. Those are really my only complaints. But in terms of the content, in terms of the meat of it, this is a really great resource. And I would highly recommend, if you have a small group, maybe if you're homeschooling, this would be great to take your high schoolers through. If you're doing a Sunday school, if you're doing a seminar or something, there's a lot of different ways you could use this wonderful curriculum by Tim Lane and Paul Tripp, How People Change.